Everyone, and welcome to JavaScript Level 2. So far, we've only really covered the basics of JavaScript, and now it's time to expand our understanding by learning a little more about advanced material. And in this section, we're going to be covering three main topics: functions, arrays, and objects. Functions are going to allow us to reuse our code. Arrays are a data structure that will allow us to store data sequentially, and then we'll learn about objects, which will allow us to store data with key value pairs. Three really important topics, and we'll also have exercises for each of these topics for plenty of practice. By just learning these three additional topics, we're really going to be able to expand our capabilities with JavaScript on the front end. Okay, I hope you're excited, so let's get started. I'll see you at the next lecture. Hello everyone, and welcome to Part 1, Functions. Functions are going to be our main building block when we're ever dealing with JavaScript code, and honestly, any code. They're going to allow us to easily reuse code more than once and not constantly repeat ourselves. If you've already programmed in another programming language, you may just want to check out the notes to quickly grab the syntax for functions in JavaScript. But if this is your first time programming, let's take a little bit of time to describe what a function is and what it's going to look like in JavaScript, and then we'll hop over to the editor and code out a bunch of examples. So the general syntax for a JavaScript function looks like this. You have the keyword function, and that's going to indicate that you have a function. Then you have the actual name of your function, and you're going to decide whatever you want the name to be. And then you also have the option of passing in parameters. And you could also not have any parameters. So here I just showed two parameters, parameter 1 and parameter 2. And someone using the function could pass in parameters required for the function to do something with. So you would pass in those parameters, and then inside that code to be executed, inside those curly brackets, you would do something with those parameters. So let's go straight to the editor and our console to really show how to create and use functions in JavaScript and get a better understanding of what's actually going on here. I'm going to jump to my editor now. Alright, so I have my editor open. I have an HTML file that's linked to myscript.js, and here I have a blank myscript.js. And that HTML file is open and linked here in the browser. And if you want, you can also put everything that we're typing straight into the console, but it's going to look a little better if you put it into Atom. Let's start off with the most simple function we can think of, which is just a hello function. So I'm going to put in the special keyword function, call my function hello, so I give it a name, close parentheses, so it won't have any parameters, then the curly brackets, and inside this function, I input some code, and I'm going to input log, and we will just say hello world. And this is the most basic function we can have. So what's actually going on here? I have my keyword function, then the name of my function. In parentheses, I'd pass in any parameters. In this case, we won't pass in anything yet. And then whenever this function is called, I will log hello world. So let's save this. If we refresh our page, we'll notice that we can actually call hello, hit enter, and we get hello world. So in our browser, after running this JavaScript connected to this HTML, I can now call this function here. And what I want you to note is sometimes what happens is students get confused on how to call a function. They'll just type in hello over here with no parentheses, hit enter, and they actually get back the function itself. So the difference here is that one of these is calling the function and the other one is just returning it. So I'm going to zoom in a little more here just so you can see what I'm talking about. In this case, I called the function to execute with the parentheses there. In the second case, I'm actually just calling the function, but I'm not executing the function. And in that case, JavaScript says like, oh, you wanted the function? Well, here it is. This is what the function actually is. With the parentheses though, you're telling JavaScript, okay, actually execute that function. All right, let's expand this example by calling the function hello you. And we will pass in a name. So that's my parameter, name. And in this case, I will say console log hello plus name. So I will save that. Let's clear our console and then refresh our page. And now what we're going to do is call hello you. Whoops. Clear console. Hello you. And note what happens if I just type hello you with no parentheses. It returns back the actual function. But I want to call the function. So I will say hello you. If I just have parentheses with no name parameter, I'll get hello undefined. So that's important to note here. Because I expected something to be the name, a parameter to be passed, in this case, since I didn't pass anything, it just said hello undefined parameter. What I really should do is something like this. Hello, you, and then pass in that name parameter, which in my case, I expect a string there. So I will say, hello you, Jose, and it says, hello, Jose, in the actual console. So that's the very basics of a function that accepts some sort of parameter input and then uses it within the function code itself. And later on, we'll also talk about scope of a function, which is pretty important as well. But for right now, the basics here that I want you to get is that you can put in a parameter and then use it within your actual function code. And the main idea of a function overall is that I don't have to keep typing console.log every time that I want to do something. All I have to do is call hello you. And this is going to be really useful for more complicated functions. Let's expand this to a simple function, but a function that takes in 2 parameters. I'm going to delete this. And if you see, you can start typing fun, hit enter, and you get something like this, function name. Note that it's camel case, meaning that we don't use underscores, but instead we separate words by lowercase and then uppercase letters. In this case, no pun intended, I'm going to say add num as my actual function name, and then I will take num1 and num2 to be the function parameters. And then I will log num1 plus num2. So let me save this, and I will clear the console. Well, actually, I should refresh the page to make sure add num is loaded up. So here I refresh the page. Let's call add num, and let's pass in 2 and 3. We hit enter and we get 5. All right, so what's actually happening here? Well, add num is taking in 2 parameters, and I called the parameters num1 and num2, and then inside the actual function code, that block, it's going to add them together and then log that. But let's see what happens if I say add num hello, comma, world. If we hit enter, we notice that we get hello world back. Something to remember here is that we can concatenate strings with this addition sign. So later on, we'll be talking about making sure that you have the correct data type you expect whenever you're creating a function. Because right now, this function is a little too loose in what it expects as a parameter. It'll end up working with either strings or numbers, which isn't very good for us, because that means if we call this function later on in our code and we accidentally do something like this, add num, and we pass in maybe a 2 as a string and a 2 as a number, you'll end up getting something like 22. But that's not really what you were probably expecting. You may have been expecting 4. So this is kind of a dangerous situation to be in because of JavaScript's type coercion. So usually you want to check types or make sure the operations will only work on certain data types. So that's just a little warning, but we'll talk a lot more about that later on in the course. For right now, what I really want you to understand is that I have 2 parameters and I'm using them inside my function call. Okay, now let's talk about default values. So far we've had to define every single argument or parameter in the function when using it. But we can also have default values by using an equal sign. And let me show you an example of that. Again, I will create a function here. The function name will be hello someone. It takes in a name, and it will console log hello plus that name. But instead of having name be undefined, if no one passes in a name, I'm going to have a default name. And let's make that default name Frankie. So let's see what happens now when I refresh this page and I call hello someone. If I call hello someone with Jose as the parameter and I hit enter, I get hello Jose. But if I call hello someone with nothing inside of it and I hit enter, I get hello Frankie. So we can use an equal sign in this manner to actually assign default parameters in case a parameter is not supplied by the user. Okay, so that's default parameters. Now let's talk about returning values. So far, we've actually just been printing or logging results. But what if we actually wanted to return results so we could assign them to a variable? And then we could use the return keyword for this task in this following manner. Let me show you what I mean by all of this. I'll create another function, and let's call it formal. And formal takes in a name. We'll give a default name of Sam. And it also takes in a title argument. And we'll also give a default title of Sir. So we have 2 default parameters or 2 default arguments there. And the terms parameters and arguments are used interchangeably a lot, so just keep that in mind. And now I'm going to say console log title plus a space plus name. So let me save this. Going to refresh the page and call formal. I'll hit enter and it says Sir Sam. Great. So what if I do this? I say welcome plus formal. Well, then it says welcome undefined, which is probably not what you expected. You expected it to say welcome Sir Sam. We can see here that it only outputted Sir Sam when the formal was called, but when I wanted to actually print this whole thing, it said welcome undefined. So if I were to actually put that all within a console.log call, so if I say welcome plus formal, and I hit enter, I get, again, welcome undefined. So you might be wondering what's actually going on here. And what's going on is this function right here isn't actually returning anything. It was just printing something one time. If we want to actually return something so we can use it in a variable, we need to use the return keyword. And let me show you how we can do that. We will just say return. You can see there's already a return keyword. And then say whatever you want to return. In our case, we'll return the exact same thing. Title plus a space plus name. And now I can save this. Refresh my page. And if I call formal, I still get the output Sir Sam. But now I can actually assign that value. So I can say variable output is equal to formal. But now if I call output, I get Sir Sam. Meaning I can also do what I wanted to do before, which was this welcome plus formal. And now I get welcome Sir Sam instead of just welcome undefined. Okay, so that might seem a little confusing at first, especially with these examples of showing the console log versus the return. But all you really need to understand for now is that if you want to save the result of a function, you want to use the return keyword so that it actually spits out something to return. So whenever I call formal, whatever it does, it's going to return what is on this line. So usually you'll have a bunch of code over here doing something, code, some more code, etc. And at the very end, you will return some sort of variable that you defined using all of this code up here. Let's break down a more complicated example by doing something like multiplication. So I will call a new function, function name, and I will call this function times 5. And we'll say num input. So it takes in this parameter num input. Inside of my function, I create a variable called result and set it equal to num input times 5. And then I return that result. So far, so good. And then if I refresh this page, I can call times 5, pass in a number 4, and I see I get 20 back. Okay, so that also means, since I'm using the return keyword, I can say variable, let's say variable answer is equal to times 5, and we'll pass in another number 10 here. And now if I call answer, I get 50. I wouldn't be able to do this sort of variable assignment if I was just doing a console log of the result. Instead, with this return keyword, I can now assign the result to some sort of variable. In my case, the variable is called answer. Great. So we've talked so far about using the return keyword, using parameters, and also using default parameters. Let's take a moment to talk about a really important concept that's called scope. And scope is the term we use to describe how objects and variables get defined within JavaScript. When discussing scope with functions, as a general rule, we can say that if a variable is defined only inside a function, then its scope is limited to that function. So let's consider the example we just showed here. Times 5, num input, we created a variable called result equals to num input times 5, and we returned result. If I call answer, I get 50. But if I try calling result here, I get result is not defined at anonymous. And the main idea here is that the scope of result is limited to this function. that actual variable doesn't exist outside of this function unless I define it outside of the function. So again, as a general rule, we can say that if a variable is defined only inside of a function, then the scope of that variable is limited to the function. So it's only going to be recognized when it's called inside of this function. And the same goes for these parameters. So if I come up here, back to the console, and try to say something like num input and hit enter, I will also get a not defined error. So that means that this has a bit of a local scope to the function. Now let's try to make something with more of a global scope. So the global scope is going to be different than that local scope. And basically, what happens is if we have a variable that we define outside of the function, that's going to be a global variable. And the function will have access to them due to their scope. Let's show an example. I'll create a variable. It's outside of any function, and we'll call it v. And this is going to just be a string that kind of really obviously is going to be a global variable. So we'll say global v. So that stands for global variable. So we can see variable v, just a big string out there. We'll also make a variable called stuff, and we'll say, have it be a string global stuff. And now I'm going to create a new function. It's going to be called just fun. It's going to take in stuff, and it's going to log v. It's going to reassign stuff inside, so I will reassign it literally to a string claiming its reassignment. So reassign stuff inside func, and then I will log stuff. And let's delete this top function here since we won't be using it. Okay, before we actually run this, let's break down what's happening here. I have two variables defined outside of any function. Then I'm calling function fun. I have stuff as a parameter, but no, I never actually am going to call stuff. I'm just going to do this, fun. And then I'm going to say console log v. I never define v inside the function, it's only defined up here. I will reassign stuff only inside the function, and then I will say console log stuff. Let's save this and run it in our browser. So refresh, and I get this, global v, reassign stuff inside function. Now let's add one more line of code after this function call to execute the function. And I'm going to say this, console.log, and I'm going to log stuff. And let's see what happens when we actually run this code. So let me save that and refresh and run. So it says global v, reassign stuff inside func, and then global stuff. Okay, let's break down all the lines of code here and actually explain what's going on so we get a really clear idea of scope. So this whole idea that we're talking about right now is known as scope. So the following happens. Console.log v is going to check for the global variable v, the outer scope. If it can't find anything there, then it's going to check for the local scope inside of the function. And if it can't find anything there, then it's going to throw an error that it was never defined. Console.log stuff over there at the bottom will also check for the global variable stuff. And then the call fun stuff is accepting an argument stuff, then it's printing out v, and then it's reassigning stuff only inside the scope of the function. And then it's going to print out stuff. So notice two things here. The reassignment of stuff only affects the scope of the stuff variable inside the function. And the fun function first checks to see if v is defined at the function scope. And if not, which is our case, it will then search the global scope for the variable names v, leading it to print out this global v as a string. Okay, so really take your time with these few lines of code and understand what's happening here. Really make sure you understand why global v is printed out, why we get this reassigned stuff inside function, and then even with the reassignment inside of this function, since that's only happening at a local level, even after I call the function on line 11, when I print out stuff on line 12, I still get back the original global stuff. Thanks everyone, and welcome to part 2, function exercises. Let's get some practice with functions. What I want you to do is open up the file part2 underscore functions underscore exercises.js, which is located under the JavaScript level 2 folder. The problems will gradually get harder as you go along. Let's take a quick look at this file and look at the problems. Okay, so this is what the exercise.js file looks like, and a lot of these problem statements are sourced from codingbat.com, which is a great website for practice problems if you want to get more than what's here in this file. But basically, you're going to have a problem, the name of the problem, and it's going to ask you to write a function to take in particular parameters and then give an output. And after the problem statement, you'll see an example of what it should look like. So here we can see the sleep-in function, when it takes in false and false, it should output true. And if we keep going down, we see something like monkey trouble. If monkey trouble function takes in true and true, it should output true, etc. We go down to string times, and it says given a string and some integer, do something with it. So string times, we see it takes in a string, a number, and then outputs that string multiplied as many times as the number shows here. Then we see lucky sum, which is another problem, takes in 3 numbers, outputs a certain number depending on what's going on. And then finally, we have problem 5, which is a speed ticket problem. You get a number and a Boolean value, and you either get 0 or 1 or a 2. So if we go all the way down, we get this bonus problem, which is make bricks. This is a pretty tricky problem. So if you can't figure this one out, don't worry, that's why it's a bonus. Go ahead and read the problem, see if you can figure it out. But this has to do not so much with JavaScript, but more of just computer science and trying to think like a programmer. Okay, so we'll leave that one as a bonus for you. Go ahead and tackle the other 5, and I will see you in the next lecture where we're going to be programming through the solutions. Thanks, everyone. And welcome to the solutions lecture for the function exercises from part 2. I'm going to hop over to the editor and get started. Okay, here I am at the JavaScript file, and let's start off with problem number 1, which is actually quite simple, but it may be a little tricky at first. You can do it all in one line, so let's see how we can do this. The basic question here is we want to write a function called sleepin that takes in 2 Boolean parameters, weekday and vacation. And if the parameter weekday is true, it means it's a weekday. And if the parameter vacation is true, it means we're on vacation. And we want to sleep in if we're on vacation or it's not a weekday. So let's see how we can do that. It's actually quite easy if you remember your comparison operators and logical operators. What we can do is just check that it's not a weekday with an exclamation mark. So we say it's not a weekday, or vacation is true. Because remember, these are just Boolean values, and that's actually all you had to do for this particular function. So that's the solution for sleep in. Check that it's not a weekday, or using the 2 pipe operators, that we're truly on vacation, that vacation is true. Next up is a similar problem called monkey trouble. And here we have 2 monkeys, A and B, and the parameters A smile and B smile indicate if each is smiling. And we're in trouble if they are both smiling, or if neither of them is smiling, and return true if we are in trouble. So here is an example. If A is smiling and B is smiling, then we are in trouble. If neither of them are smiling, then we are in trouble. If it's one or the other, true, false, then we're not in trouble, false. Okay, so how can we do this? Again, this is actually another one-liner. We'll say return. I want to check for the case where they're both smiling. So since these are both Booleans, I can just say A smile and B smile. So if that's true and true, then I am in trouble. So that's one case. Or we have to remember the other case. So I can also put the second case in parentheses, where neither of them are smiling, which is going to look almost the same, except in this case, I have these not operators here. And that's the solution in one line right there. So we check the case where they're both smiling, or the case where neither of them are smiling. Anything else, we'll just return false. Let's continue on to problem number 3. And if you are having trouble with these and did them in multiple lines, don't worry. I'm showing these solutions on purpose because once you've done a lot of programming and you're more of an experienced programmer, these are the type of solutions you're going to be naturally doing. If you still got the question right, but did it in multiple lines, don't worry. If you're just a beginner, that's totally fine as well. As long as it actually works, don't sweat it. Moving along to problem 3, string times. So we are given a string and a non-negative integer n. and we want to return a larger string that is n copies of the original string. And we see here some input and output examples. So how can we do this? Well, let's type up some code and show you. I'm going to make a variable called return str. And that's going to be the string that I return. And to start off with, it's just an empty string. And then I'm going to say variable I is equal to 0. And I'll make a while loop, a while loop that says while I is less than n, the return string that I made is going to add str, which is the actual input string. And then I'm going to increment I. And once that while loop is done, then I just return the return string. And that's all there is to it. So let's review what's actually happening here. I make an empty string. I initialize I to be equal to 0. And then while I is less than n, I'm going to keep concatenating the str, the input string, to the return string. And then I increment I by 1 until I reach n. And after that, this while loop is over. And then I just return the string itself. So hopefully you remember here how to use a while loop and the fact that you can concatenate strings together. Moving along to problem number 4. This one's a little more mathematical. In this case, given 3 numerical values, a, b, and c, return their sum. However, there's a little special rule to it. If one of the values is 13, then it does not count towards the sum. And values to its right also do not count. So for example, if b is 13, both b and c do not count. So if a was 13, then none of the values would count. So here we have function LuckySum, and let's see how we can do this. It's actually just essentially a bunch of if statements to check for the various cases. So the first statement, if, I'm going to say if a is equal to 13. Remember, that was the case where if a is equal to 13, then it doesn't count and nothing to the right counts. So right off the bat, if a is equal to 13, I'm going to return 0. And then I'm going to check for the next case. And that next case can be another if statement. If b is equal to 13, return a. And then we can say if c is equal to 13, in that case, return a plus b. And if none of those returns get executed, we could return a plus b plus c. So that's how you can do this with just a bunch of if statements. But let's rewrite this now to use if, else if, and else statements. So I'm going to delete this. You can pause the screen if you want to see this code. It's also the code that's in the solution. But let's show you now with if and else if statements. So if a is equal to 13, and I was using double equal sign there just because we assume that we're actually going to get integers, not strings. But if a is triple equal sign to 13, I return 0. Then we have else if. So if b is equal to 13, then I'm going to return a, which makes sense because that's the only one to the left of b. Then we say else if c is equal to 13, then I'm going to return a plus b. And else, so if a is not equal to 13 and b is not equal to 13 and c is not equal to 13, then I just return the sum of all of them, a plus b plus c. And that's how you can do this problem using if, else if, and else statements. It's up to you which one you want to use. They'll both work the same. Whichever one makes more sense to you is fine. And then finally, problem 5, the bonus problem. If you're driving a little too fast, a police officer stops you, and basically what happens here is we have to compute the ticket. And we have some encoded integer values, where 0 is no ticket, 1 is a small ticket, and 2 is a big ticket. And if our speed while we were driving is 60 miles per hour or kilometers per hour or less, the result is 0. If the speed is between 61 and 80 inclusive, the result is 1. We get a small ticket. And if the speed is 81 or more, the result is 2. We get a big ticket. Unless it's your birthday. And on that day, your speed can be 5 higher in all cases. So the second input, this false true, that indicates whether or not it is your birthday. Okay, let's actually write some code here. I'm going to start off with an if statement. And I'm going to say if it's your birthday. So if is birthday, speed, I'm just right off the bat going to subtract 5 from it. And then I can say if speed is less than or equal to 60, I return 0. And then I can say, we'll show it with the if statements for now. If the speed is greater than 60 but less than or equal to 80, then I will say return 1. And if none of those gets triggered, then I just return 2. I'm going too fast overall. So that's how you can do it with just a few if statements. And if you wanted to, you could rewrite these to be an if, else if, and then an else to return 2. So this would be the if statement, this would be the else if, and then this would be the else. It's really up to you, again, however you want to write them, whatever makes more sense to you. The trick I used for this was basically this very first if statement, which is outside of these last three, because it's essentially just saying, okay, if it is your birthday, then the speed is -5. And that way I can just check against everything except subtract 5 from it. To me personally, that's what made the most sense logically, but there's tons of solutions for this, so your logic may be totally different than what's here, depending on how you dealt with the isBirthday boolean. So feel free to share in the Q&A forums your solutions. Finally, we have the bonus make bricks. And for this bonus problem, we wanted to make a row of bricks that is some sort of goal inches long. And we have a number of small bricks that are 1 inch each, and a number of big bricks that are 5 inches each. We want to return true if it is possible to make the goal by choosing from the given bricks. And this is a little harder than it looks, but it can actually be done without any loops and in a single line. And like I said before, if you can't figure this one out, don't worry, that's why it's a bonus. But let me show you how you could do this all in one line. I'm going to say return. And first, I will say take our goal, inches, say mod 5 greater than or equal to 0, has to be true, and the goal inches mod 5 minus the amount of small bricks has to be less than or equal to 0, and if we come back here, we want small plus 5 times big to be greater than or equal to the goal. And that's how you can do this problem all in one line. So let's actually break down what's happening here. So remember, we want to make bricks. We have a certain number of small bricks that are 1 inch each, and a certain number of big bricks that are 5 inches each. And we want to make the row that is goal inches long. And what we really want to know is return true if it's even possible to make the goal by choosing from the given bricks. So for example, if we have 1 small brick and 1 big brick, we can make 1 inch, 5 inch, and 6 inch goals. But we wouldn't be able to make 4 inch goals because we don't have enough small bricks and we have just 1 big brick. So we can't actually make that intergoal, if you will. So that's kind of the logic behind the solution. So the very first one just checks if the goal mod 5 is greater than or equal to 0, then that checks for the large bricks. And then we do this. The goal mod 5 minus the amount of small bricks needs to be less than or equal to 0 here. And basically what that means is I need to know that I have enough filler bricks between the counts of 5. So between the multiples of 5, this checks for the actual filler bricks. And then here, this last case where I say small plus 5 times big, checks that I have the right combination of small bricks and big bricks in order to at least meet or exceed the goal. Okay, so take your time. This one's really tricky to think about, and like I said, it's not so much about general JavaScript syntax, it's more about programming in general. I would recommend that you check out codingbat.com. So if you scroll all the way up here, I mentioned the actual website called codingbat.com. They actually have a full video explanation on how you can get to this one line of code for this make bricks problem. It's kind of a famous problem on the website because it's so tricky, and this solution on one line can seem so unintuitive at first. So take your time with it. Visit codingbat.com search for make bricks and you'll find that question along with a full video explanation of this specific solution for it. Okay, thanks everyone. Hope you enjoyed the exercises. Feel free to post to the Q&A forums if you get stuck on anything. I'll see you at the next lecture. 3. Arrays. Arrays are going to allow us to store various basic data types in a sequence so we can then later access them as needed. And this is all best explained through example code. So let's get started. I'm going to hop right to my browser and open up the console. Alright, so here I have the console open. And we want to know, why even bother using arrays? Well, imagine we have 3 variables that are countries. So I have this var country1, and it's equal to the string USA. Then I have var country2, we'll have it be equal to Germany. And then we have var country3, and let's have it equal to China. Now, if we wanted to, we could keep doing this, but instead of having to declare a variable for every single string, it'd be a lot easier if I just had one sort of data structure that could take in the strings themselves and name that whole thing a single variable name. And the way we can do that is through the use of brackets, which create arrays. So I will instead create a variable called countries and set it equal to an array of those strings. So now I have USA, Germany, and China. And now this saves me a lot of variable assignments. And you could have also formatted this across multiple lines. So you can do something like var countries is equal to USA, comma, and if you hit enter here, you can keep typing Germany, comma, China. So that's sometimes another way that you'll see arrays being constructed, 1 line per item, but usually it's this first way. It really depends on how many items are in the array, so just keep that in mind. Either of these ways is fine. But that's kind of the whole point of an array. Save yourself the effort of having to define multiple variables. Now let's talk about accessing elements of the array. Each element in this array is in a fixed sequence position, meaning the elements are in order and can be called by their position. So they get placed in order and they stay in order. And indexing, just like a string, starts at 0. So I will clear the console. We still have countries defined here. Whoops. Let's try that again. Countries defined, USA, Germany, and China. And if I say countries and then use square bracket indexing, I can actually grab items from that array. So let's say I want to grab China. Well, if indexing starts at 0, that's going to be 0, 1, 2. And that grabs me China there. All right, let's clear this and continue on. So again, this is just like indexing characters from a string. You can also do reassignments. You can reassign elements by accessing their index and then just reassigning it. So if I want to change China to another country, we can grab countries 2, that was where China was, and set it equal to France. Hit enter. And now when I call countries, I see USA, Germany, and France. Now you couldn't do this sort of reassignment with a string, and that's the difference between something that's immutable and something that's mutable. Okay, so let's visit a little more on this topic of immutability and mutability. And that is, just to spell it out for you, that's immutable versus mutable, coming from the word to mutate or to change. So let's clear our console and show you an example. Remember that I right now have countries as USA, Germany, and France. And I could do the reassignment as I did earlier by saying countries, whatever index I wanted to change, and then some other country. So we can make this something like Spain. And now when I visit countries again, I see USA, Germany, Spain. So that means an array is mutable. I can index and reassign. And it's a sequence. However, not every sequence is mutable. So strings are immutable. If I try to do the same action, it won't actually work. So remember, country 1 is USA. If I try to say country 1, grab 2, that's going to be equal to A. So country 1, grab 2 is A. Let's try to change it from USA to USB. The same way we did with countries. So I will say country 1, 2, and I will set it equal to B. If I hit enter here, it just outputs B. But if I actually look at country 1 to see if anything changed, it didn't. And that's because a string is immutable in this situation. So they're both sequences. We can index pretty much the exact same way, but the array is mutable and the strings are not. Okay, let's continue on by talking about mixed data types. So a JavaScript array can actually take mixed data types. We showed earlier an array called countries that only had strings in it, but I can make a variable called mixed, and it can take in anything. It can take in a Boolean, a number, and a string. And notice here that the syntax highlighting shows these are all three very different data types. And mixed has no problem holding them in. So an array can take in mixed data types. And it will also report back a length. So here we can see we have 3 items. Calling length in an array just reports back how many elements are in the array. Now let's begin to discuss array methods. So we're going to discuss just some basic methods available to you when you're working with arrays in JavaScript. And there's actually a link in the documentation to the developer.mozilla.org page, and I'm going to go to it now just to show you real quick. I have it open here in a new tab, Array JavaScript, and this says basically everything you'd ever want to know about an array. How to create an array, access stuff, loop over an array, add an end to the array, etc., remove from the front of an array. If you scroll all the way down, it has tons and tons of information about arrays. A lot of stuff that we're never going to really need or use for our use cases in the course, but if you dive deeper into JavaScript and you end up really enjoying that language, you may want to check out a lot of the stuff here. So again, a great resource, and the link is in the notes, or you can just Google search Mozilla Developer Network JavaScript Array, and it will take you to this page. Coming back to the actual console, let's start with the most basic and useful array methods. So I will clear my console and say variable myArray is equal to 1, 2, 3. Now let's talk about adding and removing elements. So to add and remove elements from an array, you use the push and pop methods. Let's start with removing the last item. So to remove the last item and return it as a new variable, you use the .pop method. So if I want a variable called last item to be the last item in my array, I will set it equal to myar dot pop. Close parentheses here to actually execute the pop method. And now when I check last item, I see it's number 3. And if I check myar, I see that I've successfully popped off and removed the last item from my array. If we instead want to add an item to the end of the array, we use the push command. Let's show you how to use that. Very similar feature, except you say myAR, or whatever the name of your array is. You type push, and inside of these parentheses, you type whatever item you want to push to the end of the array. So let's make a string called new item. And now let's check out my array. And we see we have 1, 2, and new item. And when you push the item, it reports back the length of the array after you push it. So now we have 3 items in the array, so it reported back 3. And if you want, you can also expand this. So in the console, it has a nice little feature here where it says, okay, at index 0, you have 1, index 1, you have 2, index 2, you have new item. Length is 3, and it has more information here that we'll discuss in a future lecture. Okay, let's say you want to index the last item in the array. Well, that's also really easy. You just say myar brackets, and then it's going to be myar.length minus 1. And this will return the last item. And remember, in this indexing starts at 0, which is why we're doing that minus 1. And we can actually nest arrays as well. So I can make a variable called matrix and set it equal to a nested array. So arrays within arrays. So something that looks like this. 4, 5, 6. And then 7, 8, 9. So now if I look at my matrix, I can see I have an array inside of an array, where it gets reported back how many items are in that array. But keep in mind, if I check the length of my matrix, it only has 3 items in it. Each of those items, however, has an additional 3 items. So keep that in mind when you're checking and working with nested arrays. Now let's talk about array iteration, and that is using things like for loops with an array. Okay, so let's discuss array iteration. Imagine that I have an array. We'll call it v or we'll call it ARR for array, and it's going to have just 3 strings in it. It's going to have the letter A, the letter B, the letter C, and that's it. Just 3 items in the array. And if we check it out, there we have it, A, B, and C. Imagine I want to print out A, B, and C. How could I do that? Well, I could use a normal for loop. So my for loop would look something like this. It would say the variable I starts at equal to 0, and from I, or while I is less than the length of the array, keep incrementing 1 to I, and then we will say console.log the ith element of that array using indexing. And here's how we can print A, B, and C. Now, that's the for loop way of iterating through an array, but there's also the for of statement. So we can say, if we take a look at it, I'm going to clear this so we can get a better look. For, and then in parentheses, some sort of temporary variable name, letter of the array, in our case it's called ARR, do something. So in our case, I will say console.log the letter. And here we get the exact same result. So this is the for of loop that we briefly mentioned during the for loops lecture in the course. So I can say for some temporary variable name of an array, and then we can do something with that temporary variable. And we can call that temporary variable whatever we want. So I can say something like for jelly of the array, console.log jelly, A, B, and C. And we can also do something that's completely unrelated to any elements of the array. So instead of saying console.log jelly, I could just say console.log hello, and that's going to just write hello 3 times. So hello, 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 and you can see Google Chrome has stated it was written 3 times. So that is the art of using the for of loop. Now, a really common thing that happens when you're dealing with an array is you want to pass each item of that array into a function. Let me show you what I mean. I'm going to clear my console. Imagine I want to alert the user to every letter in that array. So I will say for letter of ARR alert letter, and then close those curly brackets, hit enter, and I get an alert that says A, B, and C. That sort of thing is so common to use some sort of function for every element in an array that there's actually a shorthand for this, and it's the for each method. What you do is you take the name of your array, and then off of it you call a for each, and then you pass in the function you want to use. In our case, it's the alert function. And note that I just pass in the function itself. I do not call the function like this. So there's no close and open parentheses around the end of the function. It's just the function itself. Now if I hit enter, this does the exact same thing, A, B, and C. So again, calling a function for every element in an array is such a common occurrence that JavaScript already has it built in as a method for arrays, the .forEach method, or that you then just pass in the function itself into the forEach method. Let me show you one more example with our own custom defined array, or a function I should say. I'm going to create a function, and we'll say add awesome is the name of our function. It takes in a name, and then it will console.log the name plus the phrase is awesome. Curly brackets to end that. So what does add awesome do? Well, if I call add awesome on the word Django, it says Django is awesome. So now I will create an array called topics. It has Python in it, Django in it, and we'll say science in it as well. It's 3 awesome things. And I'm going to say topics for each, and then pass in my function, which in my case was just add awesome. I hit enter, and then I see Python is awesome, Django is awesome, and science is awesome. All right, that's really the basics of array. Remember, you have the for each method. You have the for of method as well for array iteration. You also have the pop and push methods to take things out of an array and add them to an array. You can nest arrays. Arrays can take in mixed types, and you can do reassignments for array, and you just index arrays with the bracket notation starting at index 0. If you have any questions, feel free to post to the Q&A forums, but coming up next is an exercise to get practice on all of these topics. I'll see you at the next lecture. Everyone, and welcome back to Part 4, Array Exercise. It's now time to practice using arrays in a more realistic situation, and we're going to be creating a very simple student roster app using the JavaScript code that we know so far. Go ahead and check out Part 4 Array Exercise.html file, open it up in your browser, and read the instructions there. I'm going to hop over to my browser with that file open to explain the actual exercise. Okay, so I have here the HTML file for the exercise open in my browser, and like I mentioned, for this exercise, we're making a very simple web app that contains an array of student names in a JavaScript file using an array. And the website is going to prompt you for 4 possible commands: add, remove, display, and quit. So those are things that you're actually going to type in. And this web page will prompt the user for one of these commands, and then here's what each command should do. So add will then create a prompt for a student name request. Then we add this name to the student to the array of the student names in the JavaScript file. Remove will create a prompt for a student name request. Then remove this name from the roster array. Display will print out the roster using console.log, and quit will end the while loop of prompts. So let me actually show you what this would look like. I'm going to refresh this page and run through what this may actually look like. First off, it asks me, would you like to start the roster web app? Y or N, yes or no? I'll enter Y, hit OK, and then it says, please select an action, add, remove, display, or quit. Going to add, and what name would we like to add? And we're just going to be worried about single word names, so first names only. I would like to add Jose, and then it says, please select an action, add, remove, display, or quit. So I will say display, and if I hit OK, I can see here in the console that I successfully added Jose to the student roster. Now I'm going to add another name. Let's add Sam. And now let's display the roster again. And I see now I have Jose and Sam in the array in the console. Now let's add one more name. And I will add Frankie. Oops. It said please select an action, add. Now I would like to add Frankie. And now let's display. I have Jose, Sam, and Frankie. Let's see what remove does. So it says, please select an action. I type remove. And then it says, what name would you like to remove? I'll remove my name, Jose. Let's display the array. And here we see Sam and Frankie. So I successfully removed Jose. And then to end all of this, I'll just type quit. And it says, thank you for using the web app. Please refresh the page to start over. Hit OK, and that's it. All right. So there is a JavaScript file that actually has a bunch of hints and comments. It's basically a walkthrough guide to help you out with this project. I'm going to take a look at it now. So the file you will want to use and link to your HTML file is called part4_array_exercise.javascript. This is a JavaScript file that just has a bunch of comments in it, commented hints. It's optional to use. If you want, you can go straight into the exercise without referencing this JavaScript file at all, but I would recommend that you check out this JavaScript file for the hints and the structure it provides. So again, this is available to you. It basically tells you what to do. So for instance, we've already created a roster for you, the variable roster, and we want you to create functions for the task. So add a new student. Create a function called addNew that takes in a name, uses .push to add a new student to the array. Then the remove student. And we actually have a hint here on Stack Overflow. We haven't shown you how to write a function called remove that takes in a name and then finds its index location, then removes it from the roster. So there's a link to here to Stack Overflow that will tell you how to remove a particular element from an array. Then we have display roster. Just create a function called display that prints out the roster to the console. That should be pretty easy. It's console.log basically. And then start by asking if they want to use the web app, yes or no. And now at the very bottom, this is where all your logic is going to go. Create a while loop that keeps asking for an action, add, remove, display, or quit, and then use if and else if statements to execute the correct functions that we created above for each of those commands. All right, if you have any questions on this, feel free to post to the Q&A forums. You can always check out the JavaScript solutions if you get stuck on something, or just hop straight to the next lecture where I'm going to be coding through the solutions to this exercise. Thanks everyone, and I'll see you in the next lecture. Welcome back to Part 4, Array Exercise Solution. And in this lecture, we're going to be coding through the solution for that student roster array exercise project. Let's head over to the editor and get started. Okay, so here I am with the JavaScript Part 4 Array Exercise file open. Let's start off by actually creating the functions. The first one we needed to create was the add new function for adding a new student. So we'll call the keyword function, and we can just get it by typing fun, hitting enter, and we will say add new. And add new will not take any parameters. Instead, what we're going to do is create a variable inside of add new called new name, and we will prompt the user for what name would you like to add, ? And then once we get that new name, we're going to push it to the roster. So we'll grab roster, push, and then push in that new name. And that's all there really is for adding the new student. Now let's talk about removing the student. And this is actually quite a bit trickier, and you definitely have to visit this Stack Overflow link if you're going to do it the same way I do it right now. And that Stack Overflow link basically has the answer of removing a particular element from an array. So again, we'll create a function. We'll call it remove. And I'm going to say a variable. We'll call it rem name for remove name. And we'll ask what name would you like to remove? ? And then I'm also going to create a variable called index. And this is going to be roster dot, and the method here is index of, and that was in the Stack Overflow link there. So roster.index of rem name. And then the other thing from the Stack Overflow was the splice method. And the splice method takes in index, comma 1. Where 1 is just how many elements we want to delete starting at this index. And that's all there is for the remove function. Let's continue on with the next one. The next one we want to do is display roster. So that one's actually quite simple. It's basically just logging the roster. So we're going to say function display. Doesn't take any arguments, but we will just log the actual roster. Now it's time for basically the hard part, which is actually programming all that logic. So I'm going to create a couple more lines here just so I can see everything clearly. We're going to start off by creating two variables called start. And start is just a prompt that says, would you like to start the roster web app? And we'll only accept Y or N, so we'll tell the user Y or N there. And I will also create a variable called request that is equal to empty. And we'll see what request for is in just a second, but basically it's going to be a string. And I'm going to say if start is equal to Y, meaning the user did want to start the web app, while request is not equal to quit, I'm going to do the following. I'll ask for a new request by prompting them. Please select an action. Add, remove, display, or quit. And here is where I'm actually going to start testing for stuff, all inside this while loop. So if the request was equal to add, well, in that case, I'm going to call add new. And add new has the prompt asking for the new name and pushing it to the roster. So all I have to do is call add new, nothing else. Else if request is equal to display, that's quite easy too. I just call display. and then else if, let's say request is equal to remove. Well, in that case, I just call the remove function that I created earlier. And if we scroll all the way down, we can see the rest of these brackets to make sure they're all balanced. And I'm going to have an alert here that says, thanks for using the web app. Please refresh to start over. And as a quick note, I don't have an else statement here. I technically don't really need one for this entire thing to work. And the reason for that is because they're all within the while loop here. But something I could do is say else, and then just have it be quit. So say request is equal to quit. And basically what this does is if request is not add, remove, display, or quit, so maybe the person types something wrong, it will automatically quit. So we probably also want to say in alert here, not recognized, will quit. Or we could just say not recognized and then comment this out. And then we'll continually ask for the prompt here. All right, so that's really all you had to do. Let's actually run this and make sure it worked. I'm going to open up my browser. Okay, here's my browser. I've refreshed the page. It says, would you like to start the web app? I will say yes. Please select an action. Let's add something. We'll add Jose. Let's display to make sure it worked. There's Jose. Let's add one more. We'll add in Sammy. Display. Jose and Sammy are there. Let's remove Sammy. And now let's display again. There's Jose. And then let's try just typing some random. And it says not recognized. Great, that's exactly what we wanted. And then we will quit. And it says, thanks for using the web app. Please refresh to start over. Okay, so that's it. Looks like everything worked correctly. Thanks, everyone, and I will see you at the next lecture. Welcome back to Part 5, Objects. In this lecture, we're going to be talking about JavaScript objects. And JavaScript objects are essentially hash tables. They store information in a key-value pair. In other programming language, this is sometimes known as a dictionary. And unlike an array, a JavaScript object will not retain any sort of order. The name object can sometimes be confusing if you're coming in from another programming language because it sounds so generic. But keep in mind, when someone says JavaScript object, they're talking about a very specific thing. Now, the typical JavaScript object is in this form. It's inside curly brackets, and then you have the key, colon, and then the actual value that's associated with that key. And you then access values through the corresponding key. All right, let's hop to the console and see some actual examples of this so we can learn more about JavaScript objects. I'm going to hop to my browser now. Okay, here I am at my browser with the console open. And as a quick note, the Mozilla Developer Network has a great page on working with objects, has a great overview, talks about object properties and the various methods you can work with an object. And there's also a page in w3schools.com on JavaScript objects. And what's really common when you're working with objects for the very first time is a car object, where you have different aspects of a car inside of an object. So we can see it's actually here on both pages. So let's continue that trend by creating our first object to be some information about a car. And we'll call it car info. And I've actually written this previously, which is why you see it pop up here. But I'm going to make a variable called car info, start with a curly bracket, and then the first key I'll have is the make of the car. And the make of the car is going to be Toyota. Then the next key I have is going to be year. And it's 1990, so we can already see that a JavaScript object can take in mixed data types. And then finally, I'll have the model of the car, and that will be the string Camry. And then we've closed this all off with another curly bracket, hit enter, and there we have it. So if I call car info now, I see I have a make Toyota, year 1990, and the model is Camry. If I actually want to get a value back, so the values are Toyota 1990 or Camry, I have to call the corresponding key. So instead of indexing, like we did with an array, I will actually pass in the key. So if I want the make of the car, it looks like this. And then I get back Toyota. Something to keep in mind, especially if you're used to Python, is that by convention for JavaScript objects, the keys don't have quotes around them when you're building out the object itself. So you can see here, make, year, and model won't have any quotes around them, so they're not strings. But when you're calling the actual key value pair, you do have to pass in strings. Otherwise, if you were to just call car info and then call make in this manner, with it not being a string, JavaScript is going to get confused because it thinks you're actually referencing some variable called make earlier. So keep that in mind. When you're creating the actual object, by convention, you're not going to have a string here, but you also need, when you're actually calling the key value pair, a string here. All right, so that's just a point of confusion sometimes for beginners or people coming in from Python programming. So keep that in mind. I'm going to clear this to show another example. JavaScript objects are really flexible with the data types they can take in. So we can make let's say my new O for my new JavaScript object, and we'll say A has a string. So here's a key value pair, A hello. We'll say the key B has an array, 1, 2, 3. And then finally we can say key C has a JavaScript object inside of it, so we're nesting it. And we can say something like inside and then A, B. And let's make sure we actually balance out these brackets. And here we have my new O, so let's check it out. And it's a JavaScript object. And notice when we actually print this out, it says, oh, for the key C, we have this other object. And then I can expand this and keep checking stuff out here. Okay, let's practice actually grabbing some stuff here. So the first thing I want to try to grab is hello. And pause the video, see if you can grab hello on your own. Okay, I'm going to do it now. Well, that's pretty easy. I just pass in the string A here, and it retrieves hello. Now see if you're able to get the number 2 out of this my new O. Okay, let's try it out. I get my new O. First thing I want to do is actually grab B. And then I can see I have the array out. So I can actually, if I press up on my key, stack the calls, these indexing calls or these key calls. And if I want the number 2, well, that's at index 1. Remember, 0 is the starting index. And there I have it. There's the number 2. Now let's try to get the letter B from this very last object. So I call my new O. I have to grab the key C to begin with. Then I have to grab the key inside. And then finally, I have to grab the second item at index 1, which is the letter B. If I hit enter, let's see if I got this right. There it is, the letter B. So take your time. Make sure you can understand each of these steps for grabbing something that's nested inside of a JavaScript object. Now, as a quick note, it's definitely not that common to have something this nested. This is a pretty extreme example, but just keep that in mind, the capability that you can have objects within objects. All right, let's move along and talk about actually changing values that correspond to a key. I'm going to clear my console, and let's go back to car info that we had earlier. Remember, that's just make, year, and model. If I wanted to change the car year, all I have to do is grab car info and then pass in the key I want to change. In this case, it's year, and set it equal to some new value. So for instance, we can make it 2006. And now when I call car info, I can see that I successfully changed the year of my car. Okay, we can also use a reference to the object itself. So I can do something like this, car info, year, and then say plus equals 1. And that will also work to turn back 2007. And if I call car info, I see it's 2007 now. So that works when your value is an actual number. You can edit it that way. If we want to show an entire object, this is sometimes different by browser. So to show you what I mean, I'm going to clear this. Sometimes for some browsers, if you just pass in the object itself, it won't actually show you the entire object. But if you really want to make sure that you show the entire object, you can call console.dir and then pass in your object here. So we pass in car info, and we see we have the object itself, and then you can expand this to see the different keys and the value pairs. Now for this pretty small object, we basically got the same thing in our console, so keep in mind that if for some reason you're working with a different browser and you have a very large object that you're not able to see the entire thing, you can always call console.dir and then pass in your JavaScript object to make sure you see the entire thing and expand it. All right, continuing on, let's talk about iterating through an object. So to iterate through an object, you can actually use a for in. And let me show you what that looks like. You say for, and then you make up some temporary variable. So I'm going to say for key in, and then you pass in your object. In my case, it's car info. Open curly brackets. And a quick thing to remind you is there is no specific order to a JavaScript object. So even though I can iterate through it with a for loop, I have no guarantees about what order I'm going to grab stuff in. Sometimes year may come out first, sometimes model may come out first, sometimes make may come out first. So keep that in mind. There's not going to be any specific order. Continuing on, let's show you how to grab keys. So this is going to grab the keys. I'm going to do a console.log of the key itself, and then close that bracket. So I see here for key in car info, console.log key. And just to quickly note, I could have called key here anything. This is just a temporary variable, so I could call this jelly as well. It doesn't have to be the actual word key. So if I say for jelly in car info, I still get all the keys out. Now usually when you're programming, you want to use some sort of variable name that makes sense, so obviously jelly is not a good idea, but maybe something simple like K is a good fit here. So if I'm actually able to use this for in loop to grab the keys, it means I can grab items as well, or those actual values. So let's show you how to do that. I'll just say console.log, and then inside of this I can call car info, and then access at that key. Let's show that. And here we say make Toyota year 2007 model Camry. And that's just by doing car info at that key. All right, that's all we're going to discuss right now for this first part of JavaScript objects. In the next part of part 5 objects, we're going to discuss object methods. Let's quickly review what we've covered so far. JavaScript objects are key value pairs. You have a key and then you have a value that corresponds to that key. If you want to actually grab something, you can use bracket notation to do it. So again, if I clear my console here, I can say the name of my object, and in square brackets, pass in a string that corresponds with whatever key I'm interested in. So in this case, if I'm interested in grabbing the make, I get back that key value pair. And then if we want to actually iterate through a JavaScript object, well, I can just use this for in. And I grab the keys here with my temporary variable name, and if I want to grab the actual value that corresponds to that key, well, then I just make the call with the variable name inside of this for loop. And that's really all you need to know about objects at this time. Coming up next, we're going to discuss a really cool feature of JavaScript objects, which are object methods. Thanks everyone, and I'll see you at the next lecture. Welcome back to the continuation of part 5, JavaScript objects. Let's continue by discussing object methods. Object methods are essentially functions that are inside of an object. For example, imagine we have our car info object from the previous lecture. We have the make, year, and model, and then we actually input a function there as the value for a key. So the key is car alert, and the value there is an actual function call. And the function call just says, alert, we've got a car here. And then we can actually call that method off of the car info object, meaning we can actually call methods off objects, and they essentially act as functions inside of an object. Now, more realistically, what you're going to want to do is use key value pairs from the object itself, and in that case, you're going to need to use the special this keyword. And the this keyword can be confusing for beginners at first, so don't worry if you don't immediately fully grasp it. We're going to be seeing it when we talk about jQuery. But again, coming back to the previous example, here my function doesn't actually use any information that pertains to the object. It doesn't use the make, year, or model. It's just a function that gives a basic alert. But imagine I want to actually use some of those key value pairs from the object itself. Well, the this keyword acts differently depending on the situation. For a JavaScript object, the this keyword is set to the object the method is called on. Let me show you an example of what I mean by that. Imagine I have this very simple object where it just has one singular property, and that is the number 37. If I wanted a function called report prop, or I should say a method called report prop inside of my object, then I call report prop function, and it returns this.prop, where this is acting as a reference to the actual object. And then if I were to say something like console.log myObject.report prop with the call, it would log 37 into the console screen. All right, here's a really good link for more details on the this keyword. Again, it behaves differently in different situations, and we're only really concerned about it right now as it behaves in an object in reference to methods. So let's code out a few more examples of object methods to get a better grasp on everything that I just briefly mentioned. I'm going to hop over to the console now. All right, here I am at the actual console. Let's create a very simple object. We'll call it the variable simple, and it's going to be an object with a property. We'll call it prop, and that property is, we'll say hello, and then it's going to have a method inside of it, and we'll call this method my method, just to make it very clear everything that's going on here. And then I use the function keyword, close parentheses, so it doesn't actually have any parameters there. And then I'm going to say alert. Actually, let's make this a console.log, and it's going to console log the my method was called. And then let's close off these parentheses here. So there is simple. So again, simple is an object, and note when I actually show simple, it doesn't display the methods, it just displays object with the single property, that key value pair prop hello. If I say console.dir and then pass in simple, there I see an object that I can continue to expand to see my method and that property. Again, you could have also continued to expand up here, but that's just a simple note. Depending on what browser you're using, you may find it easier to say console.dir. Anyways, back to actually learning how to use this method. If I want to call the method, I just say simple dot and then call my method. And if I call my method here without any close parentheses and hit enter, then it just reports back the actual method inside of the object. Just like when we were calling functions, we need to actually have an open set and closed set of parentheses on it. That way it can execute the function, which means I will call dot my method, close parentheses, and here it says the my method was called. Perfect, that's exactly what we expected. So again, just to review, here I have the property, there it is with the key value pair, and here I have my method. We do a function call, and then inside these curly brackets, whatever we want to actually execute whenever we call that method off of this function. Now let's see how we can use actual properties that are already in the object inside of my method. So I'm going to clear this. Alright, so to show the use of the this keyword, I'm going to create a new variable, and we'll call it my obj for my object, and we'll set it equal to an object. The object is going to just have one property. We'll say it's the name, and the name is going to be Jose, or you can just fill in whatever name you want there. And then let's actually give it a method, and we'll call this method greet, where we actually greet whosever name is in my object here. So I have greet, and I'm going to call the function keyword, curly brackets, and then here I'm going to say console.log, and I want to say hello, and then concatenate the name in my object. And the way I do this is by using the this keyword. I call this dot, and then I actually pass in whatever property I want, the key to that value pair. And in that case, it's going to be name. So I say this dot name, and it refers to the current object I'm in, whatever property that is. And that's how we can actually create a method that uses properties of the object we are currently in. So what we need to do now is actually close off and balance off these brackets here. Let's make sure that worked. Let me hit enter there. Okay, perfect. And then I'm going to call my object. It's an object with a name. If I want to see that name, I could also just say name, Jose. And now let's check to see if it actually worked when I call greet. So I will call greet. And remember, just like a function, if I don't have open and close parentheses here, hit enter, nothing's going to occur. So I need to open and close those parentheses to actually execute this. And it says hello, Jose. So I forgot to put a little space after hello. So let's fix that. I'm going to come back up here. There's my object. Let's fix that by putting a space in there. And now let's call my object greet again. And then I see hello, Jose. Okay, and that's really the basics of object methods as far as we need to know them. Again, the main thing to get out here is that an object method is essentially just like a function call inside of a key value pair. And if you want to use the properties of the current object you're in, all you have to do is use the this keyword, and syntax highlighting will show you that it's a keyword, and then you say dot, and then whatever the property name you want to use it. Okay, so hopefully you have a better understanding now of how objects actually work in JavaScript, how to create methods inside of an object, and how to use the this keyword. Coming up next is an exercise to review everything we learned about JavaScript objects. Thanks everyone, and I'll see you at the next lecture. And welcome back to Part 6, Objects Exercise. So for this exercise, check out the file part6_objects_exercise.js, which is under the JavaScript Level 2 folder. It contains 3 objects along with tasks that involve you adding methods to each of these objects. Let's take a quick look at this file and what you have to do. Okay, so this is what the file looks like. It has 3 problems, which have 3 basic objects. You're given an object that looks like this for the first one, and then we want you to add a method called nameLength that prints out the length of an employee's name to the console. And then for problem 2, you're given the same object, this employee object with a name, job, and age, and we want you to write a program that will create an alert in the browser of each of the object's values for the key value pairs. So for example, it should alert name is John Smith, job is programmer, age is 31. So remember the use of the this keyword in order to solve this. And then back to problem 3, the very last one, we just want you to add a method called lastName that prints out the employee's last name to the console. And for this, you're going to have to do a little bit of research because notice the name comes as just a single string with a space in between. And you're going to need to figure out how to split a string to an array. And there's a hint here, a link to W3 Schools where they show you how to do that. All right, those are the 3 problems. Pretty simple. I'll see you at the next lecture where we actually code through the solutions. Welcome back to Part 6, Object Exercise Solutions, where we're going to be coding through the solutions for the previous exercises. Let's hop over and get started. Okay, for the first problem, what we had to do was actually console log the length of this name. So how can we do that? Well, first we need to create a method. I'll call the method nameLength, and then what I'm going to do is call the function, and then have these set of curly brackets here, and I will console log, and then I'm going to say this.name.length. And we didn't see an exact example of this, of calling another property off the initial key value pair property, but hopefully you're able to figure this out. So again, this refers back to employee, our current object. Then we have name, which is this property right here, and then I want to grab the length of that name, which I say with .length. And that is how you grab the length off of this name. Let's go down to problem number 2. In problem number 2, we wanted to write a program that will create an alert in the browser of each of the object values and the key value pairs. So for example, it should alert my name is John Smith, job is programmer, age is 31. So I'll call this method report. We call the function. It won't have a name. And then I say alert, and I'm going to say name is, and then let's concatenate everything we need. We want this.name, and then I also want to, concatenate, comma, job is, and then I want to say this.job, and then I'm going to concatenate with, comma, age is, and then I will concatenate that with this.age. And that's all you had to do for this one. It's basically a bunch of this calls. So again, this employee, and then grab the actual properties name, job, and age, and concatenate that all into a single alert call. All right, finally, the last problem, problem number 3, which was add a method called lastName that prints out the employee's last name to the console. This one was a little bit trickier because you had to figure out how to split a string to an array in order to just grab this right here. Let's show you how we can do that, in case you weren't able to figure it out. I'll create a method called lastName, type in function, and then what I'm going to do is say console.log, and I will grab this.name, and what you had to do is you had to figure out, you can call .split on a string, And then as a parameter to that .split method, you can pass in whatever you want to split on. And I want to split on a blank space here between the first and last name. And then after that, that returns an array. So I will index for the second item in the array, which is the last name, at index 1. And that's how you can create a method that prints out the employee's last name. So again, just to quickly review this one, this becomes the actual object we're in right now, called the .name property, and that's the string John Smith. I'm going to take John Smith and then call split, and I pass in an empty string here. Well, it's not empty, there's space there, because I want to split on the space, and that returns an array of 2 items, the first name and the last name, John and Smith, and I want to grab the second item at index 1, which is Smith, and that's the last name. Okay, hopefully you enjoyed those, and you were able to figure them all out. If you had a little bit of trouble with them, don't worry about it too much. We'll get more practice later on in the course. Thanks everyone, and I'll see you at the next section.